Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl, aka Artsy Island Girl for Pajama Crafter Stamps. This week is Pet Week at Pajama Crafter Stamps. So on the Facebook page, you're going to see a lot of different pet inspired cards. Today, I'm creating a card using the My Best Friend stamp set, and I'm going to watercolor it. Now to watercolor it, I'm using some watercolor cardstock, and I prefer to stamp and emboss my images. I like having that raised lip when I'm watercoloring, and I also like the fact that it gives you a different texture on your cards. Anytime I'm creating, I always love finding ways to add different interest and different texture. So by watercolor or by embossing the image, it has that raised glossy look from the embossing, and then it just adds that texture. I'm going to be using some distress watercolor pencils to watercolor my image, and they have a bit of a creamy, chalky matte look to them. So it's going to be a nice contrast to the gloss from the embossing. So I put my cardstock in my stamping tool. I stamped the image after putting some embossing powder tool on my watercolor cardstock, and then I'm pouring some extra fine embossing powder on there. Anytime as possible, I do like to use the extra fine embossing powder. I find it gives you just a little bit more detail. However, it is finer, so you actually can't see it on this video, but in real life, there's little tiny black specks on my watercolor cardstock here. I'm just using a soft brush to move them away, and then I'm just kind of blowing them off to make sure that they're not on the cardstock when I'm heat embossing it. We don't want to melt those pieces onto the cardstock because they're there to stay once they're embossed. Once I have that cleaned up, I can use my embossing tool to melt that powder in place. It's, again, hard to see on the video, but it goes from a granular matte look to a nice shiny glossy line. I have two different distress watercolor pencil sets that I'm using. I'm using set 1 and set 2 for my colors. You can use whichever your favorite medium for watercoloring is. You could even use dye-based reinkers for ink pads. Those work as well. One of the reasons I like using watercolor pencils is they're very little mess. I just use the pencil and then my water brush, and my water brush has water in the handle. So you always have a piece of paper towel to my right that I will flush the brush with to clean it, to make it clean for the next color. When I'm using the watercolor pencil, when you first start using it, you're going to have a lot more water than the pigment from the watercolor pencil, so it's going to be a lot lighter. But you'll see as I'm working with each of the colors, as I work with it a little bit more, I'm getting more and more of that pigment. This is Kitsch Flamingo. It's just a light pink to do my background. I'm using a paper from the Cat's Meow paper pad for one of my layers for my cards. So my background colors are chosen to coordinate with that printed paper. Obviously, if you're using a different printed paper, you would choose ones to or colors to coordinate with the paper that you're choosing. When I'm using this red color here, you can really see how as I'm using more, I'm taking more and more color from that watercolor pencil. That color is getting a lot darker, and that's what I'm talking about. When you first do it, there's very little color and a lot of water, so it's going to be very pale. But as you keep going, that water is going to seep into that watercolor pencil. You're going to get a lot more color, and you're going to be putting a lot more color on your paper. So it's a little bit more forgiving that way. You start with a lighter color and you can build it up and add more as you're going till you get it as dark as you want. I know that I'm going to be die cutting this down, so I don't necessarily need to go all the way to the edges. I know that there's going to be a good portion of this that it's going to be die cut out, but I do want to make sure that I watercolor to the edges of that die cut. So I'm trying to go almost all the way out to the edges so that I know I have watercolored enough. I'm using a medium color pink for the inside of the ears so that we have some nice pink on the inside of the ears. And then when it comes to the dog, I'm using a combination of two different browns and a black. I want to have that variation of color to it so it has a lot of interest to it. To me, this image looks like a Yorkie, so that's where I'm choosing my colors from. I'm starting with the lightest color of brown, going around the outside edges and pretty much coloring the whole thing. Then I will go to the darker brown, and then lastly, I'm going to be adding dots of black. Now, while I'm working on this, I'm trying to keep the whole surface of the dog wet, so then when I dot other colors in there, they start to blend and bleed. If those pieces or those areas start to dry, that's when you start getting watermarks or getting harsh edges between your colors. So I want to try to make sure that it stays wet in order to have those colors blend with each other nicely and easily. And I'm also trying to start off light and just add a little bit of color, darkening it each time so that I don't get too much color on there and have to try to take it off. When you're watercoloring, it stays on the be on the surface for a little while. So it is easy, or it is possible to remove some color with it. It's always easier though to not have to do that. So I'm working with the medium color, and then I'm going to add just some of the dark colors. I'm not working from a reference photo. I'm just kind of guessing as I'm going. But if you have someone that has a Yorkie, this is a perfect time to, kind of take a picture of that Yorkie and use that as an inspiration and try to match the color markings with that dog. I think that would be fun. So once I go in with the black, I find that the lightest color has kind of started to dry. So I'm going to put some dots of the black, and then I'm going to go in after cleaning my brush off and just wet those areas just a little bit. I don't want to have harsh dots of that black in different areas. So by wetting it, I can make sure that that black is going to start to blend and bleed into those browns, and they're not going to create dark splotches on the dog. The nice thing about this area, this too, is it's a small enough area that it's easy enough to do the whole thing. If after I'm done, I feel like I need to touch it up, I can just wet the whole area and then touch up some of those colors that I feel like it needs. And then as it's drying, it's going to continue to blend and bleed as that water starts to dry out of it. So this has sat for just a few moments and it is mostly dry. This is the paper that I'm going to use for the mat. So that's why I chose those pinks and purples. I thought the hearts worked perfectly with the sentiment that says, "Thanks for being my best friend." So I'm using a rectangle layering die. I have two other layers that I've die cut, one being that printed paper and one some black cardstock, because even those printed hearts have black outlines to them. I have black embossing on my dog image here, so I thought a black layer would coordinate nicely with it. Because I have to wait for my watercolor to completely dry before adding the layers to the card, I want to add some glossy accents on the eyes, on the nose, and on the tongue of the dog. This is going to give it some nice glossy dome dimension. It's another way that I like to add texture. Often if an image will or suits it, I will put some stickles on there, which is like a glitter glue, to add some sparkly texture to it. This image, there's nowhere to put it that it makes sense, so I'm not doing that. I'm putting just the glossy accents, and I'm going to let that dry completely. I let it dry for probably about a half an hour to make sure it was totally dry. If you're ever guessing if your glossy accents is dry, it starts off with a milky look to it and then it dries perfectly clear. And what I like to do is I will take a scrap piece of paper and make dots that are similar in size to the ones that I have on my project. That way, if I want to test it, I can test that scrap piece of paper rather than testing my actual project and possibly ruining it if I haven't waited long enough. So once I've layered my layers together, I put my acrylic block on there. It just holds everything nice and flat. And I really like the card as it is, but there's an adorable dog bone stamp in this stamp set. And I thought it would be really cute to have a little dog bone sitting in front of that dog. Now I could have done this while I was stamping and put it on there so that it was within the image. But by doing it on a separate piece and fussy cutting it, it's also going to add image or texture to that card and give it just a little bit more interest to it. So I'm using some brown embossing powder for this image because I thought black was going to be a little bit too harsh for it. I stamped it on a scrap piece of watercolor cardstock. No point in using a full piece. I always keep my scraps so that I can easily stamp small pieces on here or test colors. If I'm looking for a particular shade, I'll use the scraps of watercolor cardstock to put some of those colors on there and pick and choose what color I have here. I'm choosing a really light brown or a light tan color for the bone, making it darker towards the bottom, lighter towards the top. Once I've let that dry completely, I'm using some detail cutting scissors in order to cut that out. When I cut out or when I fussy cut, I pretty much keep the right hand with my scissors in the same spot. I use my left hand to move that paper, move the line that I want to cut within the blade of the scissors. And I also tend to tilt my scissors so the bottom blade is a little bit in, so we have a slanted cut and we don't have any of that cardstock showing outside of that. So once that's totally cut, I'm going to use my glue and I'm going to glue that bone in place. This way I can put it right in front of those dog paws and I don't have a double stamped image or don't have to worry about getting a pristine image. I really like it as a separate piece on there. I think it totally adds to it. You'll find all the Pajama Crafter Stamps products that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below. Please go and check out the Facebook group for more pet card inspiration. I can guarantee that you won't be disappointed because they always have fabulous makes there. Have a fantastic day. Thank you so much for joining us today.